The final meeting felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a coronation. Amelia sat on one side of the polished mahogany table, flanked by her father, Marcus Thorne, a man whose presence filled a room with the dense gravity of old money. They were a portrait of victory. Amelia, in a crisp white suit that seemed to radiate its own light, looked every bit the triumphant heiress reclaiming her birthright. Marcus's expression was one of bored satisfaction, the look of a king watching a minor border dispute resolve exactly as he'd ordained. On the other side sat David. He wore a simple gray tweed jacket, a bit worn at the elbows, that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He looked, by design, like a man who had already lost. His lawyer, a quiet, meticulous woman named Ms. Albright, had a stack of papers in front of her, but the energy in the room suggested they were mere formalities. The battle was over. This was the division of the spoils. So, to summarize the primary asset distribution, Amelia's lawyer, a slick man named Peterson, announced with a theatrical flourish, Mrs. Thorne, Amelia, will retain the primary residence at 44 Willow Creek Lane, with its surrounding 10 acres. He smiled, a predatory flash of white. And Mr. Reynolds will take possession of the secondary property, the original farmhouse plot, designated Lot B, encompassing the remaining 2 acres at the far east end of the estate. Marcus coughed, a dry, dismissive sound. Possession of the teardown, you mean? Let's call it what it is. Amelia laughed, a light tinkling sound that held no warmth. It was the sound of jewels clinking together in a velvet bag. Oh, Daddy, be nice. David always loved that old ruin. He said it had character. Let him have his character. She turned her gaze to David, her eyes the color of a winter sky, holding a mixture of pity and contempt. You'll be happy there, David. It's you. The insult, wrapped in a silken bow of condescension, hung in the air. It implied he was a relic, a thing of the past, something to be discarded while she moved on to a brighter, more luxurious future. For 12 years, he had been the quiet, steady foundation she built her social life upon. The unassuming architect husband who made her seem grounded, even as she and her family systematically chipped away at his confidence. He was her pet project, the brilliant but impractical man she had tried and failed to mold into the corporate shark her father wanted. Now the project was being decommissioned. David's face remained a placid mask. He met her gaze, his own eyes a deep, steady brown. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. Inside his worn leather briefcase, his fingers rested on the smooth, cool cover of a bound report. It was a geological survey, dense with seismic data, core sample analyses, and magnetic resonance imaging charts. It was a document that spoke a language of stone and time, a language of immense pressure and unimaginable wealth. It was a secret history of the land, written in oil. He thought they were taking everything. He thought they were leaving him with nothing but a worthless pile of wood and 2 acres of dirt. They didn't know the dirt was the prize. They didn't know that beneath the crumbling foundation of the old farmhouse lay the Thorne Reynolds oil deposit, a subterranean reservoir valued conservatively at $52 million. Within 6 months, their world of arrogant certainty would be fractured beyond repair, and his quiet world would be transformed forever. He simply nodded. I accept the terms. The quiet finality of his words sealed the deal. Amelia's smile widened. She had won. She had the mansion, the status, the freedom. She had, in her mind, taken everything of value. David let her believe it. Patience, he had learned, was a form of power, and his was about to yield a spectacular return. We've all felt it, haven't we? That sting of being underestimated, of being dismissed by people who think they know our worth better than we do. It's a universal feeling, whether it happens in a boardroom, at a family dinner, or across a divorce lawyer's polished table. Where are you watching this story from today? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. David's journey is just beginning, and it's a powerful reminder that the game is never truly over until the quietest person in the room has had their say. Now let's get back to the story and see how the seeds of this spectacular reversal were sown. The drive away from the lawyer's office was a study in contrasts. Amelia and Marcus departed in a gleaming black Mercedes, the engine a low, satisfied purr. They were already discussing the guest list for the divorce party Amelia planned to throw at the main house, a celebration of her liberation. David left in his 10-year-old Volvo, a car Amelia had often called his Professor Mobile, with a sneer. It was reliable, understated, and paid for, qualities she had never learned to appreciate. He didn't drive back to the life that was ending, but toward the one that was about to begin. He drove toward the Teardown. The farmhouse stood at the end of a long, unpaved lane, hidden from the main road by a stand of ancient oak trees. It was exactly as Amelia had described it, a ruin. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the silvered wood exposed to the elements. One of the porch supports sagged, giving the front of the house a weary, lopsided frown. The windows were clouded with the dust of disuse. To anyone else, it was an eyesore, a monument to decay. To David, it was the repository of his past and the key to his future. This house had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had been the antithesis of Marcus Thorne. Where Marcus was polished, inherited wealth, David's grandfather had been raw, self-made grit. He had been a builder, a farmer, and in his youth, a wildcatter who chased whispers of oil across the dusty plains of Texas before settling here. He had built this house with his own hands. David had spent summers here as a boy, listening to his grandfather's stories, learning the language of wood, soil, and sky. He parked the Volvo and walked up the creaking steps, the key feeling solid and real in his hand. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and time. Moonlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes in a single, ethereal beam. Amelia had never set foot in here more than once. On their first visit to the estate after they married, she had peered inside, wrinkled her nose, and declared, "It smells like poor people." She never went in again. David walked through the small, square rooms. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn fireplace mantel, a single, massive piece of oak his grandfather had hauled from the woods himself. He saw not decay, but legacy. He saw not a teardown, but a fortress. The marriage had been a slow, insidious erosion of his sense of self. It hadn't started that way. When he first met Amelia, he was captivated by her vibrancy, her confidence. He was a young architect, just starting to make a name for himself with innovative, sustainable designs. He saw beauty in structure, in integrity, in things built to last. She said she admired that about him. She said he was a refreshing change from the vapid, predictable men in her social circle. But her admiration was a form of ownership. Her family, the Thornes, saw him as raw material. Marcus had taken him aside early in the marriage. "You have a good mind, David," he'd said, swirling a brandy that cost more than David's monthly rent at the time. "But architecture is a slow game. It's for tradesmen. You're a Thorne now, by marriage. You need to think bigger. I could find a place for you at Thorne Industries, a real job, vice president of something or other. We'll figure it out." David had politely declined. He loved his work. He loved the process of creation, of turning an idea into a physical space that could shape people's lives. He didn't want to be a vice president of something or other. He wanted to build. That was his first, and perhaps greatest, sin in their eyes. He had refused to be assimilated. From then on, the slights became a quiet, steady rhythm in his life. At dinner parties, Marcus would introduce him with a patronizing air. "This is David, Amelia's husband. He's an architect. He draws pretty pictures of houses." The other guests, all titans of finance and industry, would offer him a brief, dismissive nod before turning back to conversations about mergers and acquisitions. He was an ornament, and a slightly disappointing one at that. One of the most searing humiliations had come a few years into the marriage. David had been a finalist for the prestigious Pritzker Architecture Prize, a monumental achievement for an architect of his age. The nomination was for a low-income community center he had designed pro bono, a beautiful, light-filled space built from reclaimed materials. He was immensely proud of it. The awards ceremony was in Chicago. 2 days before they were supposed to leave, Amelia had announced she couldn't go. "Darling, I'm so sorry," she'd said, not looking up from her phone, where she was scrolling through photos of a gala she'd attended. "Muffy's charity auction is the same night. I'm on the committee. I simply have to be there. You understand." He did understand. He understood that a social obligation to a vapid socialite took precedence over the single greatest professional honor of his life. He went to Chicago alone. He didn't win, but the nomination itself was a career-defining moment. When he called Amelia to tell her the results, she'd seemed distracted. "Oh, that's a shame, honey. But you'll never guess who bought the Fabergé egg at the auction. We raised over $1 million. He had slowly withdrawn after that, not out of anger, but out of a need for self-preservation. He became quieter, more observant. He continued his work, but he stopped sharing his successes with her. He funneled his earnings not into the lavish lifestyle she demanded. Her father's money took care of that, but into his own discreet investment portfolio. He built a fortress of financial independence that she never knew existed. He learned to exist in the background, a silent partner in a marriage that had become a hollow performance. He was the silent enabler of his own diminishment, failing to fight back, choosing instead to strategically retreat. Now, standing in the dusty silence of his grandfather's house, he felt not the sting of those memories, but the cold, clear focus of a man whose moment had finally arrived. The house, the land, this was his legacy. Amelia and Marcus thought they had exiled him to a forgotten corner of their world. They had no idea they had just handed him the throne. He walked to the back window and looked out over the 2 acres of overgrown field. It looked like nothing, just weeds and dirt. But David knew better. His grandfather's stories hadn't just been about farming, they had been about the land itself. "This land has a secret, Davy boy," he used to say, his eyes twinkling. "It's got a deep, dark secret." For years, David thought it was just a folksy tale. But after his grandfather passed, he found his old journals, filled with strange notes, hand-drawn maps, and references to oil seeps he'd found as a boy. It was a breadcrumb trail left across a century. It had led David to commission the survey, to turn family lore into geological fact. The report in his briefcase was the culmination of that journey. It was a conversation with his grandfather, a promise fulfilled. He was no longer just an architect of buildings, he was the architect of his own vindication. The weeks following the divorce were a period of quiet, methodical industry for David. While Amelia was busy sending out embossed invitations for her Freedom Gala, David was coordinating with geologists, lawyers, and a select group of investors. He didn't operate out of a gleaming corporate office. His command center was a small, rented workspace in a nondescript building downtown, a place of quiet efficiency that suited his personality perfectly. Most people, including Amelia, had assumed his architectural practice was a modest, boutique affair. They had no idea that for the past 5 years, he had been a silent partner in a highly successful international design firm, specializing in large-scale, sustainable urban planning projects in Asia and the Middle East. His work was prestigious, influential, and most importantly, incredibly lucrative. He had built a considerable fortune, a fact he had deliberately concealed from Amelia and her family. His quietness was not weakness, it was strategy. His simple Volvo and worn tweed jacket were not signs of failure, they were camouflage. He knew that in the Thorne family's world, wealth was a weapon, and he had no interest in entering their arms race. His wealth was for building, for creating, for independence, and now for justice. His primary ally in this new venture was a man named Mr. Chen, a Singaporean investor with whom David had worked on a green city project outside of Kuala Lumpur. Mr. Chen was a man of few words and immense perception. He understood power not as a loud declaration, but as a quiet, unassailable position. When David had first approached him with the geological report and his plan, Mr. Chen had listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on David's. After David finished, Mr. Chen had taken a long, silent sip of his tea. "This is not a financial matter for you, is it, Mr. Reynolds?" he'd asked. "It is a financial matter," David replied calmly, "but it is also a matter of structural integrity. A flawed foundation must be exposed before a new structure can be built." Mr. Chen had nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He understood the architectural metaphor perfectly. "The arrogant are blind to the ground beneath their feet," he said. "They look only at the sky. We will proceed. Petrocorp is hungry. They will pay a premium for a domestic source of this quality, especially one with clear and unencumbered title." And that was the beauty of it. The title was clear. In her haste to secure the grand mansion and publicly humiliate him, Amelia had eagerly signed the papers drafted by David's meticulous lawyer, Ms. Albright. The agreement contained a clause that was a masterpiece of legal precision. It stated that Amelia would relinquish all present and future claims on Lot B, its structures, and all associated subterranean and mineral rights, whether known or unknown at the time of signing. The phrase "known or unknown" was the key. Peterson, Amelia's flashy lawyer, had likely skimmed right over it, focused only on securing the main house, the visible prize. He hadn't bothered to do a thorough title search on the worthless plot of land. It was an oversight born of arrogance, and it would prove to be a multi-million-dollar mistake. Meanwhile, life at 44 Willow Creek Lane was a whirlwind of social activity. Amelia hosted a series of lavish parties, each one more extravagant than the last. She was in her element, the queen of her domain, surrounded by a court of sycophants who praised her exquisite taste and her newfound freedom. The story of the divorce had become a popular anecdote in her circle. She would tell it with a dramatic sigh, painting David as a pitiable, unmotivated man she had generously set free. "I gave him the old farmhouse, of course," she would say, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the east end of the estate. "He was always so sentimental about it. It's best he has a place to potter about. I couldn't bear to see him completely adrift." Her friends would murmur sympathetically, shaking their heads at David's foolishness and praising Amelia's boundless generosity. Marcus Thorne, too, was enjoying the victory. He had successfully excised the one element of his daughter's life that he couldn't control. He'd brought in a new suitor for Amelia, a hedge fund manager named Julian, who was as slick and polished as a new sports car. Marcus saw Julian as a far more suitable match, a man who spoke the language of money and power. One afternoon, as David was on the porch of the farmhouse replacing a rotted floorboard, he saw Amelia's convertible cruise slowly down the lane. Julian was in the passenger seat. Amelia slowed the car to a crawl, pointed directly at the farmhouse, and said something to him. Julian threw his head back and laughed, a loud, braying sound that carried across the field. David didn't have to hear the words. He knew the tone. It was the laughter of the victor, the casual cruelty of the confident. He paused his work, hammer in hand, and watched them drive away. He felt a flicker of the old sting, the familiar ache of being an object of ridicule. But it was quickly replaced by something else, a feeling as solid and deep as the bedrock beneath his feet. It was the calm assurance of a man who holds a royal flush while his opponents are still celebrating a pair of kings. He took a slow breath, turned back to his work, and drove a new nail into the fresh wood. The sound of the hammer strikes was clean and final. Each one felt like a step closer. Each one felt like a nail in the coffin of their arrogance. He wasn't just fixing a porch, he was building a stage, and the final act was about to begin. Autumn arrived, painting the oak trees in fiery shades of red and gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke in damp earth. David had spent the last few months making the farmhouse habitable, not renovating it, but restoring it. He repaired the roof, replaced the clouded window panes with clear glass, and got the old cast-iron stove in the kitchen working again. The house was still rustic, still humble, but it was now solid, warm, and filled with a quiet dignity. It was a reflection of the man who lived there. The time had come. The contracts with Petrocorp were finalized, the initial payments secured in an escrow account, and the drilling schedule was set to begin in the spring. All the pieces were in place. All that remained was the revelation. David could have simply let them find out from the news, when the first drilling rigs appeared on the horizon, a shocking new feature on their pristine landscape. But that wasn't his way. This wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. It was about forcing them to look at what they had so casually dismissed. It was about the moral mirror. He needed to see their faces when the reflection of their own arrogance was revealed to them. He sat down at the simple pine table his grandfather had built and penned a letter. He didn't use email or a text message. This required a certain gravity. He used thick, cream-colored stationery and his best fountain pen. The message was simple and formal. "Dear Amelia and Marcus," it began, "I am writing to request a meeting with you both at your earliest convenience. There is a final matter pertaining to the division of the estate's assets that I believe requires a direct discussion. I would suggest we meet here, at the farmhouse, this coming Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Please let me know if this time is agreeable." He signed it simply, David. He placed the letter in a matching envelope, addressed it to the main house at 44 Willow Creek Lane, and sent it via registered mail. The formality of it, the registered delivery requiring a signature, was a calculated move. It would signal that this was not a casual request or a desperate plea. It would pique their curiosity and, more importantly, their sense of superiority. The letter arrived at the mansion 2 days later. A housekeeper signed for it and delivered it to Amelia on a silver tray as she was having breakfast on the veranda with Julian. She slid it open with a pearl-handled letter opener, her brow furrowing slightly as she read. "What is it, darling?" Julian asked, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin. "It's from David," she said, her tone a mixture of annoyance and amusement. She handed the letter to him. Julian read it and chuckled. "A final matter of shared property? Sounds ominous. What do you suppose he wants? Did he find a leaky pipe he can't afford to fix?" "Probably," Amelia said, waving a dismissive hand. "He's likely run through his savings and wants to contest the settlement. He wants a handout. It's pathetic, really. Are you going to go?" "Oh, I have to," she said with a dramatic sigh. "Daddy will want to be there. He'll put him in his place once and for all. It might even be entertaining, seeing him in that dusty hovel, begging for scraps. It's the perfect end to the story, don't you think?" She smiled, the picture of magnanimous pity. She called her father immediately. Marcus's reaction was one of irritation. "What does he want now? Hasn't he taken up enough of our time?" "He says it's about the property, Daddy. He wants us to meet him at the farmhouse." Marcus was silent for a moment. His mind, ever the calculator of risk and advantage, turned the possibilities over. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll be there. It's time we made it clear that the books are closed. Permanently." He envisioned a short, brutal meeting where he would crush whatever pathetic hope David was clinging to. The thought gave him a grim sense of satisfaction. And so, the meeting was set. On Saturday, they would drive down the lane to the Teardown to deliver their final, crushing verdict. They saw themselves as judges about to sentence a man who had already been condemned. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with a palpable stillness. David prepared the farmhouse as if he were setting a stage. He cleaned the new windows until they sparkled, allowing the bright autumn light to flood the main room. He polished the old pine table until it shone with a soft luster. He placed 3 simple, ladder-back chairs around it, 1 for him, 2 for them. In the center of the table, he placed a single, slim folder made of plain manila cardstock. It contained 3 documents: the Geological Survey summary, the signed contract with Petrocorp, and a copy of the divorce decree. On the morning of the meeting, a light fog hung over the fields, muting the world in a soft, gray light. By midday it had burned off, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was cool and still. It was the quiet before the storm. David sat in his chair, facing the door, and waited. He was not nervous. He felt a profound sense of calm, the calm of an architect who has reviewed the blueprints 1,000 times and knows with absolute certainty that the structure is sound. The foundation was flawless. The reckoning was about to be built upon it. At precisely 2 o'clock, the sound of an engine, much too powerful and aggressive for the quiet country lane, announced their arrival. The black Mercedes crunched to a halt on the gravel outside. The car doors opened and closed with solid, expensive thuds. A moment later, 2 figures appeared in the doorway, their sharp, tailored silhouettes framed against the bright afternoon sun. Amelia and Marcus stepped inside, bringing with them a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. They were dressed for a corporate takeover, not a visit to a rustic farmhouse. Amelia wore a severe black dress and sunglasses so dark they looked like voids. Marcus was in a bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. They paused just inside the door, their eyes sweeping the room with undisguised disdain. "Well," Amelia said, removing her sunglasses with a slow, deliberate motion, "it's certainly clean." "You've been busy, David." The compliment was laced with poison, implying his life had been reduced to simple housekeeping. Marcus didn't bother with such subtleties. "Let's get this over with, David," he said, his voice clipped and impatient. He did not sit. "What is this all about? If you're here to ask for money, the answer is no." The settlement was more than generous. David remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the table. He gestured to the 2 empty chairs opposite him. "Please," he said, his voice even and low. "Sit down. This won't take long." Amelia exchanged a look with her father, a small conspiratorial smirk. They were indulging him, playing along with his little drama. They sat, their postures stiff and imperious, like monarchs holding court in a peasant's hut. "Thank you for coming," David began, his gaze moving from Marcus to Amelia and back again. He let the silence stretch for a moment, forcing them to lean into it. "I asked you here to discuss a final asset related to this property, an asset that was not properly valued during the settlement." Marcus scoffed. "Not properly valued? It's a 100-year-old shack on 2 acres of weeds. Its value is in the land, and even that is negligible. We were generous to let you have it at all." "You're right," David said, his agreement so unexpected it momentarily silenced them. "You did let me have it. I believe your words, Amelia, were, 'Let him have his dirt patch.' You called it a teardown. You said it was worthless." He wasn't accusing, he was cataloging. He delivered the lines as simple, indisputable facts, holding up the moral mirror so they could see their own words reflected back at them. Amelia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We're not here to reminisce, David," she said sharply. "What is your point?" "My point," David said, his voice still unnervingly calm, "is that your assessment of the property was inaccurate." He reached forward and with a quiet, deliberate motion, opened the manila folder. He slid the first document across the polished surface of the table. It was the summary page of the Geological Survey, dominated by a colorful, topographical map showing a massive, deep red anomaly directly beneath the farmhouse. Marcus glanced at it, his expression one of bored confusion. "What is this? Some kind of soil report? Are you trying to tell us there's a drainage problem?" "It's a seismic survey," David said. "It shows what's under the soil, about 9,000 feet under." He let that sink in. Then he slid the second document across the table. It was the cover page of the Petrocorp contract. The logo was large and unmistakable. This time Marcus's attention sharpened. He was a businessman. He knew that logo. He snatched the paper from the table, his initial boredom instantly replaced by a flicker of alarm. Petrocorp, what does this have to do with you? They've taken an interest in my dirt patch, David said quietly. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding Marcus's. They've taken an interest in the Thorne Reynolds oil deposit. That's the name they've given it. The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Amelia stared at David, her mouth slightly agape, a look of pure, uncomprehending shock on her face. Oil? Here? It was an absurd, impossible idea. Marcus's face, however, was a different story. The condescension was gone, vaporized. In its place was the frantic, calculating look of a man who senses a catastrophic misstep. His eyes darted from the contract to David's calm face and back again. "This is a joke," he stammered, but the words lacked conviction. "I assure you, it's no joke," David said. He looked at Amelia, whose world seemed to be tilting on its axis. "The initial survey estimates a reservoir of light sweet crude. The most conservative valuation, based on current market prices, places the deposit's worth at approximately $52 million. Silence. A profound, ringing silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of a log settling in the cold fireplace. $52 million. The number was obscene. It was a fantasy. And yet the grim reality of it was sitting on the table in the form of a legally binding contract with one of the largest energy corporations in the world. Amelia's carefully constructed composure shattered. 50 million? She whispered, the words catching in her throat. She looked around the rustic room, at the plain wooden walls and the simple furniture, as if trying to reconcile this humble setting with the astronomical sum David had just named. The room suddenly seemed to her not like a hovel, but like a treasure chest she had willingly, stupidly given away. Marcus's mind was racing, cycling through denial, rage, and a desperate search for an angle, a loophole. As a lifelong businessman, he understood the language of contracts and assets better than anyone. He flipped through the pages of the Petrocorp agreement, his hands trembling slightly. He saw the numbers, the signatures, the clauses outlining royalty payments and drilling rights. It was real. It was all horribly real. "This is a shared asset," he snarled, his voice a low growl. He dropped the contract on the table and pointed a finger at David. "This is a marital asset. The divorce settlement, it doesn't matter when it was discovered. It originated during the marriage. We will sue. We will take you for every penny." He was trying to regain control, to reestablish the old power dynamic through threats and intimidation. He was Marcus Thorne. He did not lose. David watched him, his expression one of almost clinical detachment. He let Marcus's tirade fill the room, and then, when the older man finally ran out of breath, David reached into the folder one last time. He produced the third document. It was a copy of the divorce decree. He didn't slide it across the table, he simply held it. "Page 7, Section 4, Subclause B," he said, his voice as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Ms. Albright, my lawyer, was very particular about the wording. I'll read it for you." He cleared his throat and read in a clear, measured tone. "The party of the second part, Amelia Thorne, does hereby relinquish all present and future claims, rights, and interests in the real property designated as Lot B, including any and all structures thereupon, and all associated subterranean and mineral rights, whether known or unknown at the time of this agreement's execution." He placed the document on the table on top of the others. "Known or unknown," he repeated softly. "Your lawyer, Mr. Peterson, was so focused on securing the mansion that he didn't bother with a deep title search on the Teardown. He didn't question the clause. You were in such a hurry to be rid of me and this place that you signed it without a second thought." The full weight of the situation finally crashed down on them. It wasn't just that David had found oil. It was that they had, with their own signatures, on the advice of their own expensive lawyer, handed it to him. They had been so blinded by their arrogance, so certain of his worthlessness and the worthlessness of his property, that they had orchestrated their own catastrophic defeat. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted with the gravitational force of a collapsing star. David, the man they had pitied and mocked, was now in a position of unassailable strength. And they, the victors, the elites, were the ones left with nothing. Amelia was the first to break. The shop gave way to a desperate, panicked pleading. The mask of the haughty Ice Queen dissolved, revealing a frightened woman on the verge of hysteria. "David, no," she said, her voice cracking. She reached a hand across the table, as if to touch his arm, but stopped short. "David, please. We were married for 12 years. We built a life together. You can't do this to me, to us." Her appeal to their shared history was so jarringly out of place, so transparently self-serving, that it was almost pathetic. She was trying to find a key to a lock that no longer existed. David looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion showed in his eyes. It wasn't anger or triumph. It was a deep, profound sadness. "Us?" he asked, the words soft but heavy. "Amelia, when was there ever an us? When did you ever see me as an equal partner? When did you ever defend me when your father publicly belittled my work, my passion, my very identity?" He leaned back in his chair, the quiet architect once more, laying out the blueprint of their failure. "This was never about doing something to you. This is the result of what you did. You placed a value on everything. You valued the mansion, the cars, the parties, your social standing. You valued this land at zero. You valued me at zero. It turns out your valuation was simply inaccurate." His words were not cruel, they were true, and their truth was more devastating than any insult. He was holding up the moral mirror again, and this time, Amelia couldn't look away. She saw the reflection of her own callousness, her own superficiality, and she flinched. The tears that welled in her eyes were not just for the lost money. They were for the sudden, stark realization of her own character. Marcus, however, was not a man given to introspection. He saw a deal slipping away, and his instincts took over. The threats had failed, so he switched to negotiation. He smoothed his suit jacket, attempting to gather the tattered remnants of his authority. "All right, David," he said, his voice now slick with a forced collegiality. "Let's be sensible about this. You've made your point. You're a cleverer man than I gave you credit for. I admit it." It was a monumental concession for him, and it cost him dearly to say it. "But this is too big for one person to handle. You need infrastructure. You need political leverage. Thorn Industries can provide that. Let's form a partnership. We'll create a subsidiary. You'll be chairman, of course. We'll split the profits 60-40. In your favor, naturally. It's the smart play." He was offering David a place at the table, the very thing David had been denied for more than a decade. He was offering him a promotion, a title, a piece of the empire. He was trying to buy him, to assimilate him now that he had proven his worth in the only language Marcus truly understood: money. David listened patiently until Marcus was finished. He then gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Thank you for the offer, Marcus," he said, with a politeness that was more dismissive than any outburst would have been. "But I already have a partner." He gestured to the Petrocorp contract. "And I have no interest in being chairman of anything. I'm an architect. I like to build things. And I already have my next project planned." The finality in his tone was absolute. There was no deal to be made. There was no angle to be played. The door was closed, locked, and bolted. They had given him the key themselves. Marcus Thorne, the titan of industry, the man who bent the world to his will, slumped back in his chair. For the first time in his life, he was utterly, completely defeated. And the man who had defeated him was the quiet, unassuming architect he had dismissed as a nobody. The silence that followed was the sound of an empire crumbling. The days and weeks that followed the meeting at the farmhouse were a slow, public unraveling for Amelia and Marcus Thorne. The news of the Petrocorp deal broke first in the financial pages, a dry business story about a significant new domestic oil discovery. But the local press quickly picked up on the human interest angle. The unassuming architect, his socialite ex-wife, and the worthless piece of land that turned out to be a modern-day gold mine. The story was irresistible. David, through Mr. Chen's discreet PR firm, remained silent, refusing all interviews. His silence only made him more intriguing, a figure of quiet, dignified power. The first visible sign of the new reality appeared on the horizon at the east end of the old estate. A fleet of trucks arrived, and a team of engineers began constructing a high-tech, low-impact drilling pad. The sound of construction, a distant but persistent hum, became the new soundtrack at 44 Willow Creek Lane. For Amelia, it was a constant, maddening reminder of what she had lost. Every glance out of her bedroom window, every moment of quiet on her perfectly manicured veranda, was punctuated by the sound of David's victory. The financial pressure mounted almost immediately. Marcus, humiliated and facing mockery from his business rivals, became withdrawn and furious. His first move was to cut off Amelia's unlimited allowance. "You want to live in that palace?" he'd snarled at her over the phone. "You figure out how to pay for it. You're the one who signed the paper." His cruelty was a direct result of his own wounded pride. He couldn't punish David, so he punished his daughter. Without her father's bottomless fortune to sustain it, Amelia's lavish lifestyle became an anchor, dragging her down. The upkeep on the mansion alone, the taxes, the staff, the utilities, was astronomical. Her social circle, a constellation of fair-weather friends who orbited her wealth and status, began to drift away. The invitations to galas and exclusive parties dwindled. She was no longer the triumphant divorcee, but a cautionary tale whispered about at cocktail parties. The story had changed. She wasn't the woman who had cleverly rid herself of a boring husband. She was the fool who had given away a fortune. Within 6 months, the for sale sign went up in front of the mansion at 44 Willow Creek Lane. It was a stark, public admission of defeat. Amelia was forced to sell her palace, the symbol of her supposed victory, and move into a significantly smaller, less glamorous condominium downtown. The sale was a fire sale. The proximity to an active oil field, however discreet, had diminished the property's appeal to the very class of people she was desperate to impress. It was a poetic, brutal irony. David, in contrast, did not engage in a life of ostentatious wealth. There were no sports cars, no flashy watches, no extravagant parties. The first royalty check from Petrocorp was a staggering figure, but he didn't touch it for personal use. Instead, his first major act was to establish the Charles Reynolds Foundation for Structural Integrity, named after his grandfather. Its mission was to provide grants and mentorship to young architects focused on sustainable design and community-focused projects. The very work Marcus Thorne had once dismissed as a hobby. He did not tear down the farmhouse. Instead, he began a meticulous restoration, hiring the best craftspeople to bring it back to its former glory while preserving its historic character. He used the finest materials, honoring the spirit of his grandfather's work. The sagging porch was leveled and rebuilt with solid oak. The silvered wood siding was carefully restored. The interior was transformed into a space of simple, elegant beauty, a testament to his own aesthetic of clean lines and honest materials. It became his home and the headquarters for his foundation. One crisp spring afternoon, as the restoration was nearing completion, a familiar black sedan pulled up the lane. It was Mr. Chen. He got out of the car and looked at the transformed farmhouse, then at the discreet, humming drilling operation in the distance. David came out to greet him. They stood on the new porch, looking out over the land. The view was of the rolling hills and the ancient oak trees, a picture of pastoral peace. "You have built something remarkable here, David," Mr. Chen said, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He wasn't just talking about the house. "I had a good blueprint," David replied, thinking of his grandfather. "Justice requires a certain architecture," Mr. Chen recalled, quoting David's own words back to him. He smiled faintly. "This is a very sound structure. It is built on a flawless foundation." David nodded, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He had not sought revenge. He had sought balance. He had not destroyed his enemies. He had simply allowed the weight of their own arrogance to bring them down. His victory was not in their ruin, but in his own quiet creation. He had taken a place they deemed worthless and made it the center of his world. A world built not on status or appearances, but on integrity, purpose, and a quiet, unshakable sense of self. The architect had completed his masterpiece. A year after the sale of the mansion, David received an email. The sender was simply Amelia Thorne. The message was short and devoid of the artifice that had once defined her. "Could we meet for coffee? There is something I need to say." David hesitated. He had no desire to reopen old wounds, no need to see the extent of her fall from grace. He had moved on, and his life was full and rewarding. But there was something in the simplicity of the request that felt different. It lacked the familiar notes of manipulation or demand. Against his better judgment, he agreed. They met at a small, anonymous cafe downtown, far from the trendy spots she used to frequent. When she walked in, he almost didn't recognize her. The severe, high-fashion armor was gone. She wore simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was pulled back without elaborate styling, and her face was free of the heavy makeup she once wore like a mask. She looked smaller, more human. The brittle, icy edge was gone, replaced by a quiet weariness. She sat down, and for a long moment simply stirred her coffee, avoiding his eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said finally, her voice soft. "Amelia," he acknowledged with a nod. "I've had a lot of time to think this past year," she began, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in her cup. "About everything. About that day at the farmhouse." She took a deep breath. "I've replayed that conversation in my head 1,000 times, and you were right, about all of it." She finally looked up, and he saw in her eyes not the calculating glint of an angle shooter, but the deep, painful clarity of someone who has been forced to confront an ugly truth about themselves. "You asked when there was ever an us," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "And the answer is, there wasn't. Not really. There was me and my family, and you were an accessory we acquired. A handsome, intelligent accessory that we didn't quite know what to do with because you refused to behave like our other possessions. We didn't value you because we didn't understand you. We don't understand anything that can't be bought or sold." It was the most honest thing he had ever heard her say. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said, preempting the thought. "I know that's what you must be thinking. It's what I would be thinking. The money is gone. The house is gone. My friends are gone. All the things I thought made me who I was. They're gone. And what's left is..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "What's left is the person who threw away a fortune because she was too arrogant and stupid to see the value in the man she was married to." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she wiped it away with an uncharacteristically clumsy gesture. "I'm sorry, David, for all of it, for the dismissiveness, the cruelty, the disrespect, for never once standing up for you, for being a coward. I am so, so sorry." The apology, when it came, was not a desperate plea or a strategic move. It was the sound of a broken person trying to piece together the first fragments of a new identity. It was real. David listened, his own complex emotions swirling within him. He saw the woman before him not as the antagonist of his story, but as another victim of the toxic value system she had been raised in. She had been both a perpetrator and a prisoner of it. "Thank you for saying that, Amelia," he said, and he meant it. It takes courage to face that. He felt a sense of closure, but not reconciliation. The chasm between their worlds was too vast to be bridged by a single apology, no matter how sincere. He had built his new life on a foundation of integrity and purpose, while she was just beginning to excavate the ruins of hers. "I hope you find something to build, Amelia," he said, his voice gentle. "Something that's truly yours. Something that lasts." It was a blessing and a dismissal in one. He was wishing her well, but he was also closing the final chapter of their book. He was the architect, and he knew that some structures are simply not meant to be joined. She nodded, understanding his meaning completely. A sad, small smile touched her lips. "Me too, David. Me too." They finished their coffee in a silence that was no longer hostile, but simply empty. They were two strangers who had once shared a life, now separated by a chasm of values as wide and deep as the oil reserve that had brought everything to the surface. He paid the bill, they said a quiet goodbye, and they walked away in opposite directions, each toward a future the other could not be a part of. David walked out into the cool afternoon air, feeling not triumphant, but free. The last ghost had been laid to rest. His story wasn't a tale of revenge, but of reclamation. He had reclaimed his dignity, his purpose, and his name. The wealth was merely a tool, the catalyst that had forced a necessary reckoning. True worth, he knew, was not something that could be drilled from the ground or deposited in a bank. It was something you built within yourself, quietly, patiently, day by day. It was a structure built to withstand any storm, on a foundation of unshakable integrity. David's story is a powerful testament to the idea that true strength often lies not in loud declarations, but in quiet conviction. It reminds us that the world has its own way of balancing the scales, and that patience and integrity can be the most powerful forces of all. What did you think of David's final words to Amelia? Was his grace a form of strength, or would you have wanted to see him take a harder line? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story of quiet power and ultimate vindication, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Until next time, remember your own value and never let anyone else define your worth.